Good morning. When was the last time you got angry? Bring it to mind. You're thinking, I came to church to feel better, not remember all this. But bring it to mind. I don't just mean irritated or disappointed. I mean proper angry. When was the last time you got angry? Okay, you're thinking about it now. Now ask yourself this question. Was I angry about something that happened to me and what someone said or did to me? Or was I angry about something that happened to someone else? I know the last time I felt anger was because I was blocked in what I wanted to do. And my guess is that 90% of the time that we're angry, it's because we've been hurt in some way. That's human nature, isn't it? That's normal. Our self-centeredness means that we're much more affected by what happens to us than what happens to other people. We're much more angry when we experience injustice than when other people experience injustice. Now, being hurt and angry about something is not wrong. I mean, it's totally normal. It makes sense, and there's often good reasons to feel anger. The challenge is what we then do with that anger and whether we can process it in an emotionally healthy way. If you've been hurt, the key way to process your anger is to release forgiveness from your heart to the person who has hurt you, which is a really difficult thing to do. But it's an important thing to do because forgiveness mainly benefits the person who's doing the forgiving. Forgiving from the heart brings emotional healing over time, and it stops your anger settling into bitterness and resentment. Now, forgiveness doesn't stop us pursuing justice, but it does help to stop our anger morphing into a kind of permanently bad attitude of wanting revenge. But there is another different kind of anger. There is a different kind of anger, which is the kind of anger that God experiences. And it's not about being hurt ourselves. It's called righteous anger. Righteous anger is seeing other people being hurt, seeing other people suffering injustice and suffering because of the actions of others. This is the kind of anger that Jesus experienced. Okay? When he saw the way in which vulnerable people were abused, for example, we don't usually associate anger with Jesus, do we? We don't really think of Jesus as being angry. But he did have anger. He did have righteous anger when he experienced what he did see as other people being hurt. Righteous anger is a strong discomfort about the way things are and a passion to change them for the better. That's what righteous anger is. And it's that kind of anger that motivates us to speak up for truth and for justice. Now, we're in the 5th session of our series, Fruitfulness on the Front Line, which is all about living as a Christian in everyday life. And we've been following a structure which describes 6 attributes of believers on our everyday front lines. And they all begin with the letter M. Modeling godly character, making good work, ministering grace and love, molding the culture around us. And this week we're looking at number 5, being a mouthpiece for truth and justice. And we're going to look at the example of Jesus doing this. In John's biographical account of the life of Jesus, which we call John's Gospel, we read this. When it was almost time for the Jewish Passover, Jesus went up to Jerusalem. In the temple courts, he found people selling cattle, sheep and doves, and others sitting at the tables exchanging money. Now, most scholars believe this took place in what was called the Court of the Gentiles. That's the only area of the temple where non-Jews were allowed to go. And they were allowed to come and pray. But Jesus, arriving there, found that space had been turned into a kind of noisy marketplace. So the very place that was reserved and meant to welcome outsiders into worship had become a barrier keeping them out. No wonder Jesus was angry. His Father's house was meant to be a house of prayer. for all nations, for everybody, not a marketplace. And not only had it been turned into a market, but a place where extortionate prices were being charged, which disadvantaged the poor who were being exploited. So he made a whip out of cords, and he drove all from the temple courts, both sheep and cattle. He scattered the coins of the money changers and overturned their tables. To those who sold doves, he said, "Get these out of here. Stop turning my Father's house into a market." So this shows us a side of Jesus, I think, that challenges our somewhat sanitized view of him. Here we see God's righteous anger in action. Jesus could not remain silent when he saw injustice and exploitation happening in God's house. The religious leaders of all people were taking advantage of worshippers, charging excessive rates for temple sacrifices, allowing traders into the temple courts, making it nearly impossible for the poor to participate in worship. Jesus spoke up and he acted decisively. And notice that Jesus' anger wasn't about personal offense. It was about injustice towards others, particularly those who were powerless to defend themselves. His love for the oppressed compelled him to confront the oppressors, even though ultimately that contributed to the plot to kill him. His disciples remembered that it is written, "Zeal for your house will consume me." Zeal for your house will consume me. It's not very common now, is it, that you see Christians so zealous for what is right that they're willing to confront authority in the way that Jesus did. I think many of us Christians suffer from what I call terminal niceness, where we're so often keen to avoid giving offense or upsetting anyone that we go the other way and we become timid. We can give in to what's going on. But Jesus was not feeble like that. He was a man filled with power and love and self-control, and he exercised his zeal for righteousness with courage and with conviction. But having done that, he was immediately challenged by the authorities. The Jews then responded to him, "What sign can you show us to prove your authority to do all this?" In other words, who do you think you are? Who do you think you are? What gives you the right to speak up and act in this way? And that's exactly the kind of pushback that anybody, any of us who speaks up for truth and justice gets. Why should we listen to you? What credibility do you have to speak up and act in this way? Now, Jesus answered them, "Destroy this temple and I will raise it again in 3 days." Well, that's a bit of a cryptic response. They thought he was referring to the physical temple. And so they thought what he said was ridiculous. It's taken 46 years to build this temple, they said, and you're going to rebuild it in 3 days. But Jesus was referring to his own body as a temple. And he meant that his credibility would be proven by his resurrection after he had been killed. "Destroy this temple and I will raise it in 3 days." And that is exactly what happened, isn't it? They did destroy his body on the cross, and that was the high cost for him speaking the truth. And yet he did raise his body 3 days afterwards, after death, showing his divine authority to speak the truth. Now, on our everyday front lines, the places where we spend most of our time, we don't normally face the death penalty for speaking the truth. Some people do in the world, but it's not that common. But we can often face some personal cost. The prolific 20th century American film producer Samuel Goldwyn once said, "I want everyone to tell me the truth, to speak up for truth, even if it costs them their jobs." And it's true that people who speak up for truth at work are sometimes fired. When the press reports on whistleblowers, people who expose dishonesty or corruption, it's often accompanied by them being rejected by other people and their organizations. But being a mouthpiece for truth and justice isn't always a high-stakes game. It doesn't mean being confrontational all the time. Jesus often spoke the truth with incredible gentleness to people. You know, when a parent explains to a child that it's wrong to snatch other children's toys, they can speak up for justice in a firm but a gentle way. That's a frontline example in the home, isn't it? I can imagine a few parents thinking, you don't know my kids. It's a high-stakes game to tell them off. But there are times when love requires us to speak up more courageously against systems and behaviours that harm others. That might mean challenging workplace harassment, for example, or advocating for fair treatment of employees, speaking up against gossip or discrimination, or defending somebody who's been unfairly criticised. The key is asking, what would love do in this situation? What would love do in this situation? Sometimes love is gentle and patient. Sometimes love requires us to overturn tables. Jesus shows us that being a peacemaker is not always the same as being a peacekeeper at all costs. Sometimes we must disturb the peace in order to create true justice and flourishing. If you were here last week, you would have heard Chris talking about making good trouble, which helps to challenge the culture and change the culture in the right way. Well, Jesus certainly made some good trouble, didn't he, in this situation, which was damaging the access of people to worship. In our day, the recent case of Alan Bates versus the post office is a classic example of this. When the faulty post office Horizon system showed unexplained shortfalls in his accounts, he was told he was financially liable for the losses and denied the opportunity to see the post office's evidence. The post office terminated his appointment as sub-postmaster after he refused to pay the discrepancies, and he and his partner lost their shop and all their savings. But Bates refused to accept the accusations and instead became the leading campaigner for justice. He spent over 2 decades fighting for the wrongly accused sub-postmasters, eventually leading the landmark case that exposed the scandal. Now knighted, Sir Alan Bates has achieved an enormous positive change for many people who were ruined by that injustice. The compensation payouts are being done slower than he would want, but it is happening. If he hadn't spoken up and chosen to fight injustice, many, many more people would have suffered. Now, this is a big dramatic example, isn't it, of speaking up for truth, and not many of us will be called upon to do something so public in that way. But a lot of people look at what it costs people like Alan Bates in stress, and they don't want to go through that kind of thing. So they keep quiet, even about smaller things. Maybe you're aware of some practices in your everyday work and life that are not entirely honest or ethical. But you don't want to speak up because of the risk, because of the potential personal cost. Honesty is challenging in a threatening environment. But people who don't speak up when confronted by dishonesty or injustice, they suffer in a different kind of way. You suffer because of conscience. Even if you don't count yourself as a Jesus follower, you still have a conscience. If you don't speak up and you suppress the truth, you're fighting part of yourself that knows better. And that leads to a deep internal stress and ultimately a loss of authenticity. In the long run, caving in to the fear of confronting dishonesty and injustice can have as much, if not more, of a damaging effect on you than on your mental and emotional health than standing up for what's right. Because standing up for what's right matters. If you're seeing behavior on your everyday front line which is dishonest, it's absolutely right to call it out, even if that behavior is coming from somebody more senior. A boss, for example, wanted to avoid someone and said to his secretary, "Tell them I'm out." And she refused and said, "I won't lie for you, but you can also know I will never lie to you." Now that was a courageous and a credible answer, wasn't it? And it raises the question, how can I speak up in ways that are courageous and credible? My old school was in Bedford, and it was called the Pilgrim School after the novel Pilgrim's Progress that was written by John Bunyan when he was imprisoned in Bedford jail in the 19th century. And Pilgrim's Progress is a classical allegorical story about a man called Christian who makes a journey from the city of destruction to the celestial city. And on the way, he meets all kinds of characters who represent different kinds of people. Some of them are heroic, some of them ignorant, some of them even demonic. Our school motto was taken from one of the characters in the Pilgrim's Progress story, the character called Valiant for Truth. Here's a picture of our old school logo with an upturned sword representing the sword of truth that Valiant for Truth carried in the story. We had this old school hymn called To Be a Pilgrim, and I always suffered whenever we sang this old school hymn because the first line is, "Who would true valour see, let him come hither." And as my surname is Valour, whenever we sang that line, my fellow pupils would always elbow me in the ribs. So I would, "Who would true valour see, let him come hither." Now, Bunyan writes about this character, Valiant for Truth, as a courageous and uncompromising proponent of truth. But interestingly, this guy, Valiant for Truth, has to fight three enemies that come from inside him, that come from within him. And they are called wildhead, inconsiderate, and pragmatic, which in Bunyan's day meant officious or meddlesome or dogmatic in a dictatorial way. And I think these names are so insightful because when we fight for the truth, when we speak up for the truth, it's so easy to become so zealous as to be a bit wild. Or we can become so inconsiderate of other people that our words ride roughshod over their feelings. Or we can become dogmatic and officious or meddlesome, like that man with the finger, which alienates people because, these are exactly the ways we should not speak up, because then our truth lacks love or compassion. Those three traits of wildhead, inconsiderate, and dogmatic threaten the effectiveness of our witness for Christ because they undermine the credibility of our own character. And that's exactly what the world wants us to do, to neutralize our own effectiveness, for us to undermine ourselves by going over the top or be labeled as an inconsiderate Bible basher or an officious, preachy kind of person. Now, although at first sight, Jesus turning over the tables looks wild, inconsiderate, and meddlesome, on closer examination, we see that actually Jesus was extremely focused, not wild. He understood the true purpose of the temple, and that purpose had been corrupted and needed to be restored. And to do that, it was necessary to exercise force in removing the corruption, in the same way that a surgeon has to exercise force in removing a cancer by cutting it out. Now, Jesus may have appeared inconsiderate to those who were trading in the grounds of the temple, but he was not being inconsiderate to those who wanted to truly worship there and were being obstructed by the money-grabbing practices and legalism of the authorities. In fact, Jesus was being very considerate to those who were authentic worshippers. The Pharisees thought he was meddlesome and officious, but in fact it was they who were meddling in the true purpose of the temple. And they who were really officious. Jesus was authentic, credible, and self-controlled. And that is the key to whether we can speak up effectively. Because the question people are really asking themselves is this: what sort of a person are you? Are you authentic? Are you a person of credible character? That's the question we have to ask ourselves before we speak up. The way people respond to your truth will depend on how they respond to you. You see? because truth is communicated in the context of relationship. That framework of 6 M's of fruitfulness that we've been looking at can be thought of and presented in a different way. Think of it like layers in an ascending pyramid that builds towards our credibility to speak the truth. So if you've got a foundation of modeling godly character on your front line, for example, being kind and patient and reliable and self-controlled, you have some credibility. That's like the base of the pyramid. And if you built on that by doing a good job, then you've gained some respect. That's the next level. And then if you've shown some empathy and done something to show grace and love to other people, then people warm to you as well as respect you. And if your influence has had a positive effect on relationships and helped to mold the culture around you, you've earned the right to be heard. Who you are backs up what you say. You have credibility. And so this 5th M of fruitfulness, being a mouthpiece for truth and justice, speaking the truth, sits on top of this pyramid of character, competency, and personal chemistry that together make what you say credible. And incidentally, there's a last M in the framework, being a messenger of the gospel, and it's just like this one. You can't credibly communicate the message of good news unless you are good news yourself. To speak the good news, you first have to be some good news. So the question we have to ask ourselves is this: am I credible? On this model, am I credible as a person who lives the truth before I open my mouth to speak the truth? Am I becoming the kind of person whose words carry weight? When you've got a high level of credibility, you've got much more chance of having a positive effect. I want to give you a very public example of that. A man called Steve McQueen, the film director, he was awarded an Oscar for his film 12 Years a Slave. You may have seen that film. And when he got up to receive the award in front of the world's media, he was highly credible in that moment. Now, most people in the award ceremony, you've probably seen them, they're gushing and they say things like thanking their parents and all the people who've helped them and all that sort of stuff, which is all very nice. But Steve McQueen, with the world watching, did something very different. He said this: everyone deserves to not just to survive, but to live. I dedicate this award to those who have endured slavery and to the 21 million still suffering slavery today. And in that moment, he directed media attention away from himself onto the massive issue of human trafficking and modern-day slavery. That's speaking up for truth and justice, isn't it? And people listened to him because he had built personal credibility. Now, I don't know if you would count yourself as a committed Jesus follower or not, but those of us who do follow Jesus and are people of the truth must be true. We must be the example, the evidence of truthfulness, the gracious living embodiment of truth on our front lines in every situation, on every occasion. That is the key to being a mouthpiece for truth and justice. It's not just reacting to some event that happens, it's building a background of godly character, competency, and personal chemistry that makes what you say and do matter. And this is where God makes a difference. We can't be godly without God. You can try your best to be moral and upright, and lots of people do. But to be authentically godly in character, we all need God. And to be truly excellent in work, we need God to give us the skills. And to be consistently gracious, we need God's grace through us. It's the people who depend on God who more authentically reflect the qualities of God. When we talk about fruitfulness on the front line, we're talking about the fruit of the Spirit working through us. It's the Spirit who gives us godly wisdom if we ask him. It's the Spirit who helps us in our weakness. It's the Spirit living in us who inspires us. This is the difference between people who have invited God into their lives and those who are still trying to live a good life on their own. We need the Spirit of God to really make a difference. So, where are you aware of untruth or injustice affecting others on your front line? What could you do about it? Well, can I suggest that you first talk about it with some trusted friends, Christian friends first. Don't try to figure it all out on your own. You know, whenever I've spoken at Christian conferences, there's often a little queue of people wanting to chat with the speaker afterwards. You know, everybody gets it. And I find a lot of these people who want some advice about a situation they face are quite isolated on their front lines. They're isolated. They often don't belong to any support group who can help them work things through or pray for them. So because they feel isolated and they don't know what to do about a situation, they end up talking to some complete stranger who just happens to be speaking at a seminar. Now, this is part of the benefit of belonging to a small group, isn't it? And or a prayer triplet. If you come across a situation that you're finding difficult, maybe something of dishonesty or injustice, you can talk these things over with others, and you can think and pray about it and how to tackle it before making some kind of knee-jerk reaction. And when you do choose to say something or do something, you have people praying for you instead of just trying to do it all by yourself, like a lone ranger. Perhaps the band could come back up. Now, there is a place, of course, for political lobbying about justice and protesting in the street where we just mouth off about things. That's all part of living in a democracy, isn't it? Part of campaigning for justice. But that's not really what I'm talking about today. No, I'm talking about the impact that it would have if, on our society, if Christians were so admired for their character, were so respected for their work, were so loved for their grace to other people, so active in a positive way, that when they spoke up, when we spoke up in the context of our frontline relationships, people really listened. That's what I'm talking about. Because speaking truth isn't only about what you say in a moment of injustice, it's about who you've become over time that qualifies you to say it. John Stott, who was listed by Time magazine as one of the top 100 most influential people in the 20th century, said this: "If a house is dark, there is no sense in blaming the house. The question we ask is, where is the light? If the meat has gone bad, there's no sense in trying to blame the meat. The question we ask is, where is the salt that could have preserved it? And in the same way, if society is corrupt and unjust, there is no sense in blaming society for its corruption or injustice. The question we ask is, where is the church? Where is the church? Where is the salt and light of Jesus? Where are the credible people of God speaking a credible message of truth and justice and making a difference on their front line?" Challenging, isn't it? A man called Edmund Burke once said, "All that is necessary for the triumph of evil is that good people do nothing." Well, let's not fall into that comfortable trap of doing nothing. Let's become people who are recognized as authentic and credible, who speak up for truth and justice, and so change things for the better. Perhaps this week you can reflect on a situation on your everyday front line where something is not right and you're feeling the right kind of anger, righteous anger, and then talk about it with your friends and pray and ask God to help you speak up in a way that will deserve attention and catalyze change. Let's pray. Jesus, you are the truth. Help us who have received you to live the truth, to be people of integrity, in everyday life. Help us to see people and situations through your eyes and to respond in your way. Give us the courage, the conviction to speak up for what is right and to speak wisely and well. Make us people who make a difference to make our world a better place. We pray in your name. Amen.